Alrighty, so we're here today. We're doing my coilovers on my 2011 Mitsubishi Evolution. I'm going to go through the process and then show you guys all the tools you need, and hopefully it'll be helpful. Alright, so we've already done the front left coilover, and we're going to demonstrate on the front right coilover. We're putting on BC BR series. I got them about last week. We're taking off T7 coilovers that are just completely worn out. I'm going to go over some of the tools you need. First, what you're going to want to do is take off the brake line bracket. That's going to be a 12mm bolt in the back of that attaches to the back of your coilover there. You're going to need a 12mm socket with a ratchet right here. You got that, and then up top you're going to need a 14mm socket to take off the three bolts here that hold the top of your coilover on, and then back down here you're going to need a 19mm socket to get these two bolts, the strut bolts, off. There's two of those, one down here as well. So now we're going to start taking the old coil off of the front right side, and we will demonstrate how to do that. So the first thing you're going to start with removing your old suspension or coilovers is you're going to want to remove the brake line bracket from the back of the coilover. It's just connected to a stud with a nut on it. So now we will remove the brake line bracket.
On the very back, we have already loosened it a little bit.
Next step is going to be to loosen the nuts where the coilover connects to the spindle, like the bottom of the strut. So there's two 19mm bolts and nuts that connect that coilover to the spindle, I guess you would call it. And we'll be using a impact drill, or whatever you want to call it, with a 19mm socket. You could also do just a 19mm socket and a regular ratchet, but they should be very tight, so that might be difficult. So now we're just removing the nut from those bolts. Like I said, it's a 19mm socket, and we're using an impact wrench, drill, whatever it's called.
Do you think I should try to get the impact thing on it?
Jack on it first.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, you can screw it out with that. When you get the jack, push that. So when you remove those two bolts, you're going to want to have the hub and rotor supported with something. In this case, we're just using a small jack. And we are using a brass hammer so we don't beat up those. No, we're not.
We're gonna try to use, the first thing we're gonna try to use is to try to drill it out. What would you call it?
Impact wrench.
Okay, you don't have to pause it. I'll cut it out. So we're gonna use the impact socket, the impact wrench, to try to screw the bolt out. That's moving around a lot.
Clearly that's not working. Sometimes they'll just come right out, other times they're tighter in there. Now we will use a brass hammer to try and beat them out. Let's see. Let me try.
it goes.
You may have too much tension on it.
Alrighty, so that is the top bolt out of the strut. Now we will try and remove the bottom one.
Put the impact wrench again. All right, hit it.
I think I have to go under there.
Oh yeah, why wasn't that under there?
I think I have to go under there to hit it, remember?
Yeah, but we should have had the jack.
Yeah. So we're just gonna do the same thing, try and hammer that bottom bolt out as well.
Make sure you use a brass hammer to avoid stripping the threads or messing up the threads if you hit the threads with a smaller hammer. There it is. Can you still see it?
Try and twist it.
Might help to twist it to remove it the rest of the way.
Put the impact on it. Put the impact on it.
That easy.
Alright, so now that we've disconnected the brake line bracket and got those two bolts out from the spindle, we can just move the coilover around a little bit.
There's still this clip right here.
That.
I'll show you.
Alrighty, so now the coilover is completely loose at the bottom there, and all we have is the 3 bolts at the top holding it on from the top. Alright, so now that everything is loose at the bottom, we are going to loosen these 3 bolts that hold the top of the coilover in place, and that's just a 14mm socket.
You do need a deep well for one of them. This one right here, you're gonna have to use a shallow socket for. This one is the one you have to use the deep well for. And that is rusty.
And you might want to have somebody, since the bottom of the coilover is completely loose, you might want to have somebody hold the bottom of the coilover so it doesn't just drop on the ground. Because those 3 bolts are the only thing holding it in place when you get those bottom bolts out.
Got it? These are 14s, aren't they? Yeah.
That back bolt is a little tricky to get to because we have all that plastic trim in the way. But
it's gotta be over there. I think that's the one I took off.
oh, it's right here.
Okay, recording.
Yep.
So, a shallow socket. This one back here.
push the coilover up. Alright, so now that we've removed all 3 top bolts and all the bottom bolts, including the brake line bracket, the coilover will just pull right out. Alright, so now we are going to put the new coilover in. The first step with this is going to be getting the coilover up there and then sticking it through the top of the thing and just hand tightening those 3 nuts so it stays in place. Alright.
Now that he moved the coilover up, I'm going to put on the new bolts, or nuts.
And I need the socket to get out.
Snug them up for now.
Just snug them up so the coilover stays in place. You got your new coilover just hanging there. Now what we're going to do is just connect the brake line bracket to the back of the stud and the coilover. You just line it up and then put the nut, screw the nut on there. This is pretty simple.
It's easier to do this now where you can move things around than it is later when it's stuck in place.
So you just kind of want to line it up as best you can. Can be a little tricky because you can't see anything back there. Okay, so this needs to go. Isn't working very well. It's hard to line it up. All right. Now once you get it lined up, you can just put that nut on there and tighten it up with your 12mm socket. All right, now that that's snug, you can continue to line it up with that, and then slip your 2 big bolts through.
All right, right here, we're going to go ahead and stick the pin in.
So you just want to line those holes up the best you can. It's pretty easy if you have the jack supporting it. You can move it around.
You could also use one of these alignment tools right here. Would also help.
So they should just slide in pretty easily. And then just make sure there's a little groove here. You want to make sure that's lined up correctly. And it should just slide right in. And the next thing you want to do is tighten down the nuts on them. And remember, there is a top and bottom bolt.
We're showing the top one, being that's the only one you can see in the video. Same formula for both bolts.
Yeah, the bottom bolt's a little harder to get to, but
that focus was going crazy.
it's still recording.
Yeah.
Alrighty, so now when you have both nuts hand tight, you can just get your impact drill or a 19mm socket.
Hold on. I need to get, maybe not. Yeah.
I think I could probably get it.
All right, you're gonna use a backup wrench, which is the one on the left, to hold the bolt.
Alright, and now both of those are tight and our new coilover's in. We're going to want to go back up top and secure those 3 nuts at the top. So now everything's secure at the bottom, you want to come back up top and make sure these 3 nuts are super tight. And once again, that's just a 14mm socket. Because remember, we only hand tighten them when we put the new coilover in.
Time for the short socket.
Alrighty, and now that those 3 nuts are secure, that's it for installing new front coilovers. Alright, so now that we've got both of the new coilovers on the front, we're going to throw the wheels back on and jack up the rear and show you guys how to do the rears. Alright, so now that we've finished with the front and got the wheels back on, we're moving to the rear. We've already got the wheel off in the rear. And the rear looks pretty simple. All you got to do is there's one long, I can't get to it, but there's one, that bolt right there. There's one long bolt down there. There's one bolt in the bottom. So you're going to need to remove that. And then you have to remove some of your trunk lining, which we've already done. And there's 2 bolts back there. If I can get in here. Camera's all turned. But anyways, there's two bolts in there at the top of your strut, and those bolts are going to be 15 up top there, and the bolt down here is going to be a 19. 17. Alright, so to access the top of the rear coilovers, you're going to need to remove your trunk lining and this black piece. Get in here. This black piece, there's, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 clips. Actually, I guess 4. There's 4 clips that you need to remove, and this will just pull out. I'll pull that out. That piece will just pull out, and then you can get better access to the top of your rear coilovers. And the bolts for your rear coilovers are just going to be in here. There's one, and there's one on the back side there, and then that's the same for each side. So I guess two nuts that you have to take off for the rear coilovers. Alright, so we're going to start with removing that long bolt in the bottom of the rear coilover. For that, you need a 17mm socket and a universal joint, because it's kind of hard to get to. Once again, I'm using the impact wrench, but you could also use a regular ratchet, which is a little bit harder. And you'll also need a 17mm regular wrench for the backup wrench. So, let's see that side. And then this bolt also runs through a sway bar. You don't have to take the bolt all the way out through the sway bar. You can just back it out enough to get your coilover off. Alrighty, that's pretty tight on there, so I'm going to try and break it loose with a small breaker bar. Almost knocked over the camera. Alright, that should be good. I just broke it loose with the breaker bar, and then we're going to take the impact back in there and loosen it out all the way.
Nick them off?
Nah, it's almost off. Alrighty, so now that we've removed the nut on that bolt, we can back the bolt out a little bit. Alright, now that we've got that bolt pushed out, not all the way, but just enough through the coilover, it's still holding in the sway bar, we were able to push the old coilover out of its fitting. So now what we'll do is loosen those top bolts and the coilover should just slide right out. So what we're doing now is we're just going to get the new coilover in place. We're going to feed it up through the strut hole or whatever you want to call it, and we're going to tighten the nuts on the top there.
Lower it down. Lower it down a little bit more.
We're guiding that long tube up through the hole.
Lower it down just a little bit more. All right, come on out now.
Hold on, I gotta come back out.
All right.
What's the problem, man? So we're using the impact wrench again, and then just a regular wrench on the other side. Now that we've gotten that new coilover lined up and we got that bolt tightened down there, all that's left to do is make sure the top is tightened, put our wheel back on. Alrighty, now that we have got all 4 coilovers on, we put our wheels back on, got it back on the ground, put the trunk back together, we're good to go. There are some further adjustments that need to be made, I guess personal preferences with the height, and you can do harder or softer, how it rides. We can do all that later. Now I'll give you guys a look around the car.